Welcome to Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. I'm your host, Dr. Richard Miller. The mission of Mind, Body, Health, and Politics is to expand consciousness, stimulate thought, and encourage community. And the mission, I mean quite literally. The program is aimed at expanding your consciousness, getting you to think about things perhaps you haven't thought about before, giving you new ways to think about them, and to encourage community. Encourage community means being with your neighbors, hanging out with your neighbors, doing things with your neighbors and in your local community. It's a recognition that very often we can't do much if we're here in California about what's going on in Sacramento directly. We can't do much other than our votes about what's going on in Washington directly, though indirectly we can through our work in politicking. But we can do a lot in our own neighborhoods. We can get together with people in our neighborhoods, we can grow gardens, we can play with them, we can say hello, we can give each other advice. That is the essence of a small community. It can be the essence of a large community when we learn how to commune with one another. It's more difficult often in urban metropolises. The way the program works is we have guests tonight. We have Dr. Kate Rohr sitting over here. We have Linda Rohr. They're a couple who've been married, how long, Linda?
40 years.
40 years, thank
48.
you. 48 years. They've been married 48 years. And as many of you know, and you will find out tonight, recently, Kate Rohr became Kate Rohr after being Dr. William Rohr for a lifetime. We'll be talking about his transgender experience to become her, Kate Rohr. We'll be talking with Linda about what it's like to go through this as the wife of someone who's going through this kind of change. I know those of you listening are going to have questions. This is something that's extremely unusual in your lives. It's extremely unusual in everybody's lives, and that's part of why these two folks are here today, courageously here, because they want to share with you their experience so that you can know more about what it is and demystify it. Demystification is very important because often in life, what's mysterious is a little scary. We're uncertain about things that are mysterious. Once we learn more about them, they become familiar, easy to have in our homes or as friends. I seem to be getting a call right away. Let's see what we're doing here. Hello? Well, maybe an issue. That could be our first technical error of the program. Welcome aboard. Interviews with guests. I've then asked the guests to sit and listen for a few minutes while I do something called News and Notes in Psychology and Medicine. I search through journal articles, newspaper articles, various other places for tidbits of information that could be helpful to you that just came down the pike. I'll give you an example. For most of my life, when women that I know, females, have had infections in their bladders, they have taken cranberry juice. That has been something that's sort of in the culture. In fact, I think it goes back in the culture, it goes back very far in the culture. According to this article, it goes back centuries. And there's been recent research about using cranberry juice to take care of a bladder infection. The gold standard for a bladder infection, by the way, although Kate Rohr was an orthopedic surgeon, she may have an opinion on this, but the gold standard is antibiotics for bladder infection. But again, in the culture, cranberry juice is used a great deal of the time. So here's the study. They took nurses and they gave them 20 ounces of cranberry juice every single day for a year, and then compared infections that they had to a group that got nothing, no cranberry juice whatsoever. The bottom line of the study is, according to the lead doctor, and this was published in the prestigious Journal of the American Medical Association, referred to as JAMA, I'm not sure it's worth spending money on cranberry juice, said the lead doctor, particularly for patients with a fixed income. In other words, there's no evidence that the cranberry juice does any harm, but there's no evidence that cranberry juice does any good when it comes to curing a bladder infection. That's an example of a news and note in psychology and medicine, and I think it's one that was worthwhile enough to bring to this first television broadcast here at Mendocino TV. On to one more. This one is for the women, of course, on cranberry juice. For you guys out there, there's been a controversy going on in this country for quite a while with regard to the effect of testosterone on prostate cancer. And a doctor named Clark Huggins won a Nobel Prize for making the association between increased androgen, increased testosterone, and prostate cancer. In fact, in one of his articles, Dr. Huggins likened taking testosterone to throwing gasoline on a prostate fire, the prostate fire being prostate cancer. Well, along comes Dr. Abraham Morgenthaler at Harvard, and Dr. Morgenthaler says just the opposite. He says the reason that young men in their 19s, 20s, 30s, maybe into their 40s, have a much lower incidence of prostate cancer than men in their 50s, 60s, 70s, and so on, is that the young men have higher testosterone, and testosterone squelches the fire of prostate cancer rather than excites it. So we have two authorities. Morgenthaler says he tried to replicate Huggins' research and couldn't do it, and there's a controversy going on. The FDA this week came out with warnings about the use of testosterone. They feel that there's sort of a, if you will, epidemic of use of testosterone. You've seen the sales on television going on regularly, and everywhere in the United States there are sales of testosterone going on with claims of, well, lots of claims are being made for the use. What to do? What to do? Well, one thing you want to do if you're a male and you're over 50 is you want to get to a doctor and be examined, get blood tests. The whole issue of PSA testing has become controversial also. It was the gold standard. If your PSA was under a certain number, on many tests it was under 4, then you were considered okay. But if you went above, then doctors started thinking, well, maybe we ought to send this man for a biopsy or looking a little harder at his prostate because these numbers are increasing. It gets a little more complicated than this. It has to do with how fast the PSA goes up and other indicators as well. But what happened is the United States government put out a notice saying, if not stop the PSA tests, use them less, because too many people were getting biopsies and there were too many false negatives, and we have another controversial issue. The bottom line of all this is, if you're in that age group, most likely 50 or above, if you're conservative, you might say 45, you want to start getting tested in some way, and if you're thinking about taking testosterone, you want to give it a lot of consideration. Talk to your physician, talk to tribal elders, talk to anybody you know about who might have some information so you can try to make a considered decision on which part of this controversy you want to fall down on, particularly considering it's your life that's on the line. So there's two examples of news and notes. One was on cranberry juice, no longer the gold standard, at least in the culture, for women, but antibiotics still are. The prostate issue and testosterone, the controversial issue, something to be thinking about. And you guys, you're getting swamped with advertisements to take testosterone. It's going to make you bigger and stronger and sexier and better skin and everything under the pike. But now we've got questions about it, like everything else. So that's the end of the news and notes section. And now to our interview. Welcome. Welcome to Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. Thank you so much for being here today.
For having us.
We're delighted to be here.
You just came from being interviewed on a national documentary that's being made, didn't you?
Yes.
Yes, we did.
Linda, what's it like for you with all those, how many people were in your home to make this documentary?
Well, I think we had 5 crew members, wasn't it?
Or more.
5 or
well,
6.
and then you had the director and the producer, and
Yeah,
it's
and,
quite an assortment of people.
4 cameramen.
We're not supposed to talk about the details of it at this point, but
You don't have to tell me the details of the shooting,
No, but about
but
what
I'm
it was
asking
like.
about you personally, because here you are, a
It
regular
was-
person. You've been working with
yeah.
Kate as when Kate was Bill for a career here in the medical office. For those of you who don't know that, Dr. William Rohr, now Dr. Kate Rohr, was an orthopedic surgeon here in Fort Bragg, California, for many years, and Linda worked in the office as well. They were a team, and now all of a sudden you have 5 people in your home asking questions, shooting cameras.
Yes.
How was it?
It was quite an experience, I'll
Was
have
it?
to say, but it was fun actually.
It was fun.
really fun. And they're a great group of guys that
very
came
professional.
in. Very professional and down to earth, and we're there to tell our story. And we got a chance to show a lot of Fort Bragg actually, because we went to the botanical gardens, and they shot us there walking around, and we were on the streets of Fort Bragg, and we had established patients come up to us and hug us, and I mean you could not stage it.
it was all spontaneous.
It was
Very
awesome.
spontaneous. It was a wonderful feeling, and the cameramen were just
They
going
were just
crazy.
eating it up.
So one of the things you just said in describing it is that you had a chance to tell your story.
Yes.
And that's what the watchers and listeners of this program want to hear as well. They want to hear your story. I think somebody here wants to be in on the story. We'll try it again. Technical error number 2. They'll probably keep happening. Okay, what's the story? What's the story?
I think first we ought to start by saying that, we had a long, hard discussion about whether or not to become so public. It would have been very easy. We planned that I would have my surgery after I retired. But then as we thought about it, there's a lot of people who are transgendered out there who haven't had the life we've had, haven't had the advantages we've had, who are really struggling. And we thought if we don't use this opportunity to stand up for other people, and if we don't help get the message out there to help the other people, then who will? And so that's why we decided to become so public. And that's why we're here tonight, is hopefully people will understand more about this condition, which has been around forever. And which we'll probably learn more about as it becomes much more public.
For those who know absolutely nothing, it's just a word. They see it in the newspaper. Transgender. Tell us, what is transgender? What, in your words, what for you is transgender?
I don't want to get too technical, but it does require some explanation.
If you get too technical, it's too confusing. I'll interrupt you.
Please do. We know now that someone's what we might call sexual identity is really composed of at least 3 factors. There's the anatomy between your legs. There's the gender identity, what you identify as either male or female. And then there's your sexual preference. And those, with possibly other factors, come together to form what we call our sexual identity. And the world sort of is used to everything fitting in a certain fashion, where someone has male genitalia, they prefer females, and they identify as a male. But it turns out that science, and especially genetics, is not that simple, that all of these variables are independent. So in the case of transgender, what has happened is a person may have genitalia of a male, but their gender identity is of a female. And what's really striking, and which I can tell you very personally, is that, and I still don't understand, is that most transgender patients know that there's something wrong with their gender identity, or that it doesn't match the way society thinks it should match, at an age before we even know what the difference is between boys and girls. So at an age of 3 or 4, I knew something was wrong when they called me a boy. My anatomy fit a boy, but my identity didn't fit a boy. And yet, to this day, I don't understand how I knew that something was wrong, and that this identity, what we call gender identity, is something poorly understood. And even someone who's lived with it, the problem, or let's say the mismatch that society is normally looking for, whatever this thing is called gender identity, it's very strong. It does not change as you get older. You know, there's a period of time when it was thought psychotherapy and that could help people deal with this. But it all goes back now to really a Dr. Harry Benjamin in 1966 had some of the first patients, and he realized that despite someone's sex, you know, their genitalia, etc., that they can have the opposite gender identity, and that they can't change it.
And within that, they could have sexual preference for either other sex. That's
exactly.
the third variable that you
All three
mentioned.
are independent.
Now, I want to come back to something you said. You said when you were as young as 4 years of age,
Yes.
you could sense something when you were being related to as a boy, something felt that you can't quite grasp, but something didn't quite click.
I seem to identify and feel more like the girls in my neighborhood or that, you know, we would play with. I identified more with the female side of the world than the male side. And it's hard to explain what that is. And someone who hasn't had the gender dysphoria, as we call it, I'm sure doesn't understand it. But you feel like a male, I'm sure. My wife has made it very clear she's always felt like a female and never questioned that. And yet at age 4, I not only questioned it, I knew something was wrong. It didn't match what the world said it should match.
Okay, so take us further a few years down the line to give us a little developmental history of what went on then.
Well, when you're very small, especially back in the days when the word transgender didn't even exist when I was born in 1946. And I can remember that, for instance, a good example I can give that sort of, I think, helps people understand, is that my mother had this, it was sort of a standard practice in that era. I had a brother who was 2 years younger, and she would take a picture every year of the two of us, and then at Christmas time or such, these two, you know, it was done with a formally, with a photographer. They would send that out to everyone, and every year she would put us in the same shirt. You know, she would go to the store, buy us each the same shirt to take the picture and send it out. And I remember about age 5 or so, I said, I don't want that shirt that she'd picked out. And I wanted a different shirt. And I happened to go into the girls' department and picked out some shirt that was obviously a girl's shirt. And I remember the reason the episode sticks in my mind is because my mother said, okay, she was willing to let me wear this different shirt. Even though it was a girl shirt, it wasn't, I guess, too frilly or anything. But when she took it to the counter, the gal at the counter said, but that's for a girl, you can't buy it for him, and refused to sell it to my mother. I mean, that's how different the times were in those days. To this day, when I look at that picture of the two of us in the same shirt, it's still, I can remember all of how I felt at the time.
So now fast forward maybe 4 or 5 years as you're going into puberty.
Well, puberty is a very challenging time for transgendered people because, you know, when we're very young, when we're 7, 8 years old, there's really very little difference. The sex hormones haven't started to flow, and boys and girls are pretty much the same except for the physical genitalia. And then when puberty starts, and so you keep having this belief that maybe I won't turn into a real boy, you know, maybe I won't get a beard and such. And then when puberty starts, it is a frightening time because now you know things are starting to change in a way that can't be reversed. And certainly when I was a child, the surgery had just been done a few times in Europe to actually change someone's sex genitalia to match their gender. And so as you see these changes, there's a real panic that occurs because you suddenly realize that the world's playing a dirty trick on you, and you're going to become a boy whether you like it or not.
Yeah, I think it's important to underline your use of the word a panic, because the panic results in a high suicide rate amongst people who are dealing with these issues, particularly in their teenage years. I'm sure you're aware of that.
It's over 40% in most studies.
Yeah, so that's extreme panic leading to dire consequences. So tell us.
My own brother committed suicide. He was transgender and committed suicide, so I know very much about it.
You certainly do. I'm sorry to hear it. So you're going into puberty.
Well, so you go into puberty, and then
your masculine genitalia are developing.
And not only that, you start to get a beard, you start to get an Adam's apple. It's very clear.
Are you hanging around with the boys? Or you're hanging around with the girls?
Oh, no. Certainly in my age group, in those time, you had to hang out with the boys.
Okay.
I mean, you get signals from society, from everyone around you, whether your parents, your friends, that you're not going to cross that gender divide. I mean, you're a boy, you better act like a boy, especially, I mean, this is the 1950s. There was no room for, you know, there were, I'm sure, men that were more effeminate, maybe in their presentation, but you learned the lesson as a young child that you're a boy, you better be a boy, and you better play by the boy rules.
Yeah, I think it's important to let the audience know that in the 1950s, homosexuality was a diagnostic category. It was in the DSM, so it was considered pathological in and of itself. And in many areas of the United States, homosexuality was illegal. Mm-hmm. Men were literally dragged out of bars and arrested. We have motion pictures of men being arrested in Manhattan.
Well, and as a transgendered individual, they were called transsexuals in those days, was the term. And you would lose everything. I mean, if I had come out and made it clear that I had this gender dysphoria, I would have been thrown out of college. I certainly wouldn't have been allowed to go to medical school. I certainly couldn't have a medical license. You know, I would have many families, my own family, disowned my brother because of his being transgender, and yet he wasn't very overt about it, and yet he basically had to leave the house at one point.
How old was he when he suicided?
In his 40s.
So he went through a
Yes,
long period
of time.
Of terrible existence. So you're now in your teen years. You look like a guy.
Yeah.
You're acting like a guy.
Oh, you learn that.
But you have a feeling inside. What are you doing with these feelings? How are you handling them?
Well, it's hard to explain, but certainly in that era, when it was quite clear you're not going to give anyone a clue of this.
Right.
And also at that time, because the term transgender didn't exist and we didn't have the internet to learn about that there were other people like that, my panic at that age was also that I was crazy, that I honestly was crazy, and that there was something really seriously wrong with me. And so I had to hide that.
And somehow live with it while you were hiding it.
Well, you want to survive, and if you're going to survive, you just have to. What I used to say was, I'm going to take the genie and put her in the bottle and put the cork on her, and just can't let her out.
Yeah, sometimes we refer to that in psychology as the dirty secret.
It certainly felt like a dirty secret all my life.
It's a dirty secret I can't let anybody know, because if I do, terrible things are going to happen. But
well, my life was going to end. I knew it would end.
Yeah.
And quite honestly, if I'd come out in the 60s, it would have.
That's right. In many ways, it would have. So you look like a guy. You feel the difference. And what about in terms of the third category, your gender preference? How was that playing out while you're a teenager, when the guys are looking at girls and they're chasing them and so on?
Well, in my case, and I'll be very honest about it,
Hopefully.
I still happen to really love women. And I still love women, and I loved women then. So even though I have this gender identity that doesn't match my physical, sex, and that's how I had to make some big choices in life, the biggest one involving Linda.
So what happened in your case was, of the three variables that you described that make up for the transgender situation, or maybe getting into one, you connected on two, in the sense of that you were interested in women and you had the hydraulics to go with it,
yes,
if you will.
Well,
right?
I fell madly in love with this young woman.
Very early on in your life,
next
as I recall, correct?
Yes.
How old were you when you met Kate?
Oh, well,
You actually met
we
Bill.
grew up in the
we grew up in the same town.
You
and
did.
Went to the same high school, Sunday school, and everything, but we were good friends.
Uh-huh.
We had one date in high school, and that didn't go over real well. But then, and let me just emphasize that Bill at the time had at top of the class, student council president. He was, a jock. Everything, he played the role. That's what's so hard to understand, is how can someone play this role so well? And I keep saying he deserves an Academy Award, an Oscar for it, because, he just suppressed these feelings, but was able to play the role so well. which was really hard to understand.
Yes,
I
it's
had
one thing
no-
to play a role. It's another thing to play a role which is so discordant from your sense of self inside, and to be
Absolutely.
dealing with the conflict
Absolutely.
and keeping the secret. As when your actors act,
Absolutely.
but they aren't necessarily acting. That's something.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying.
Yes, that's what I'm trying to say. But,
Yeah, so-
but no one had an inkling at all. Nobody.
So tell some
Yes.
more about it. You had the first date. Nothing came of that.
No, the chemistry wasn't there at the time.
And then,
So then we reconnected after college, the summer of '66. I had graduated from a junior college, and I was home, and had gotten a job. And I'll refer. I am so used to calling her Kate now, so I'm going to say Kate rather than Bill. But she was Bill at the time. when we,
Understood.
got together.
and I hope our audience understands.
Yeah, it can be confusing if I keep going back and forth, but she was just driving around my neighborhood one summer evening, and I was sitting out on the porch, and she stopped, and she was with her best friend, and we went out for ice cream, and fireworks just exploded. It was just the right time. It was just the chemistry was there at that time. And 6 months later, we were engaged, and then 6 months after that, we were married. So,
But it wasn't quite that smooth in terms of what you're going
not
through
for her.
internally while this is going
Well,
on.
I kind of describe it as there were times when there was sort of a crisis, or what we could call as maybe a threshold that I had to decide. There was a point at which I had to decide what path I was going to go. If I was going to get married to this woman that I had this tremendous infatuation for, I realized I was going to have to, again, put that genie in the bottle, put the cork on, and it could never come out. I just couldn't do that. I mean, I was going to have to make the commitment that if we were going to get married, that I would just suppress this forever. And that's what I made that decision, and that's when we got married.
So sometimes what you did with regard to putting the genie in the bottle is referred to as compartmentalizing. That's one of the words we use, right? And we put something in a compartment, and we do everything we can to shut that door as hard as we can if we don't want to deal with the material, right? How did you do at keeping the door shut?
Great. I mean, I could. The problem that I had, and I think many other transgender people do, is that when you do suppress it, although you can prevent yourself from giving any outward indication of what is how you're feeling inside, you get angry. There are times when you get angry and really mad sort of inside. And Linda can even tell you, she there's times when she would just say, I don't understand, you're just, you're all wound up. And that's what she used to call it, that I was just wound up. And wound up is that you're frustrated, you're mad kind of, and you can't seem to control it. And one thing I discovered, and where I say, as odd as it may sound, that being transgendered was actually an advantage for me, is I learned very early, even when I was a young child, that if I could keep myself really intensely busy, especially mentally, and really kind of overload my system with just being busy and with obligations and things to do, that I wouldn't think as much about being transgendered.
Classic method for dealing with pain.
And that's what I would do. And Linda knows that it all my life.
So,
And that,
yeah, it was like there's just no stopping her. It was like she always had to do something.
Yeah.
And I had a feeling that there was some underlying reason for that, and why it seemed like she needed recognition for this or that, or was a perfectionist and always needed to be the best at her game. And I could never quite understand what it was. And I thought, well, maybe it had to do with her parents, or,
Right.
not,
Of course, family of
getting
origin.
recognition from her parents and growing up or whatever. So I never quite understood that. But I had a feeling that there was some undercurrent, there's something there that was causing this. Never, ever thinking it was that she was transgender. But then as the years went on, I noticed it getting worse, and it was like
What's the it that was getting worse, Linda?
Just
The aggression, the uptightness?
that, and just always having to have her hands in everything, and going. doing more than she really was physically able to do. You know, she just would, you know, get so tired, and but still, she kept taking on more responsibility.
When you talked about aggression, you know, I'm a psychologist, so I'm thinking that sounds like there's a lot of pain inside, because aggression comes from either frustration or pain or maybe chemistry.
Well, aggression, maybe I said that wrong, but
Irritable?
She was never, ever aggressive towards me. But I could see that she just had this anger that would build up.
I took
And
it
she
to
would
mean attitudinally. You felt an attitude, not necessarily something coming at you.
Nothing
But
ever physically or...
Yeah, I got that.
Or, yeah.
Yeah.
I just didn't want to give the impression
That's why I immediately thought
Yeah.
there was pain, and I connected it with the compartmentalization. I mean, there's only there's a certain amount of material we can stuff into compartments.
Exactly.
And
yeah.
then some of the compartments start to leak. It's because the pressure gets too great over a period of time.
Well,
you know, you've got the dirty secret, and you know it in some level in your psyche, no matter how much you've got that door shut, that it wants to come out.
Absolutely. And there were periods throughout our marriage where she would so overload with activity, and she would have a meltdown. She was just total meltdown. You know, it would, like, she'd go, and then there was nothing left. And it was like the adrenaline had, you know, she would just melt down, and she wouldn't be able to do anything.
You know, I very much
For a day or
appreciate
so.
your willingness to say that out loud, and your courage of doing so, Linda, because we don't know how many people are going to watch this.
Mm-hmm.
But there are people out there who are going through similar experiences.
Absolutely, and that's why
and
we're
you,
doing
and you
it.
know that, and that's why
That's
you're
why we're
doing
here.
it. Of course you are. And they're hearing, and they're going to say to themselves, well, if an orthopedic surgeon was going through a lot of pain, then maybe it's, you know, I can go through a lot, but this is part of my condition and what I have to deal with, rather than what you said, which I think a lot of people are also thinking, I must be crazy.
Right.
They must be totally crazy to be having these mixed, weird feelings, and what am I going to do? Maybe kill myself.
Harry Benjamin saved my life. In 1966, Harry Benjamin wrote a book called The Transsexual Phenomenon. I was an avid reader all my life of the New York Times. And one morning I'm reading the New York Times, and there's a book review. It's actually a discussion about some neurologic phenomenon now being opened up and discovered. And part of it is a book review of Harry Benjamin's book, The Transsexual Phenomenon. I was a student at Princeton then. I got on what's called the PJ&B Railroad. I literally took a train up to New York City and bought a copy of the book. And in that book I'm reading, and that's when I first understood that I wasn't crazy, that there were other people like me. Harry was way, way ahead of his time. You know, it's taken 50 years for the rest of us to catch up to what Harry knew. But Harry said this is an immutable condition. He was a good friend of Kinsey. And Kinsey sent him one of his transgender patients, didn't know what to do with him. And Harry tried everything and finally decided that the only way that he couldn't change, because psychotherapy was big back in that era, in the 1960s. And Harry said, no amount of psychotherapy seemed to be helping these people. So Harry tried cross-gender hormones, meaning giving a trans female, someone with male genitalia, female gender identity, estrogen, and saw a dramatic improvement and change in their life and everything about them. And he was one of the first pioneers to say, this condition is immutable, it's hardwired into the brain, and of course now we have a lot of data to prove that. But at that time, long before we had MRIs, CAT scans, or anybody was doing the right anatomical studies, and he was right. And I read his book, and to this day, every once in a while I read it just to remind me of just how far ahead of his time he was.
So, take us back, we're developing through your lives now. You're married, you've told us some about what you're going through. Then you had children.
Well, that was... Actually, it's a little more complicated than that.
Okay.
We had decided to hold
version.
off. I'll give it the short version. We had decided to hold off having children because I had, medical school, residency, and it just didn't seem like a good time to try and bring kids up. And plus, when we got married, we were on our own and we were broke. That's why I went to graduate school in between medical school, because I had a National Science Foundation fellowship, which paid me to go to school.
Yeah.
I mean, so we could save money so I could go to medical school. And when we tried to have children, suddenly couldn't. And we went through the fertility workup, and lo and behold, turned out I didn't have any sperm. And it probably has nothing to do with being transgendered.
Mm-hmm.
But it meant that we weren't going to have children of our own. So I say that was sort of another decision tree. I'd always promised Linda that we would have children once I got through residency, or at least through medical school. And so I had to make another decision, because it's another one of those corks I better put back in the bottle. There's just no chance that I'm ever going to come out as transgendered, because by now that was starting to appear in the medical literature if there were going to be children involved. So I stuffed the cork back in the bottle, and we adopted 2 wonderful kids.
You mean no chance you're going to come out as transgender because you're not going to put your children through that experience?
Absolutely.
That's what you meant.
I'm not going to put my wife through it, and I'm not going to put my kids through it.
Yeah.
So if I'm going to have children, again, it's another commitment that dirty secret has to be buried as deep as I can bury it.
Didn't it also have an effect on your psyche in terms of your gender identity and whatever you're dealing with internally, even though it's in the compartment? Didn't that also then get affected when you get the result about the sperm, in terms of your thinking about yourself and what that meant? I mean, how does it happen to me? In other words, right now, given who you are and a doctor for so many years, you well know that the sperm issue is not related to, and I know that also.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking at the time, whether that was a trauma, an additional trauma is what I'm asking. It wasn't.
No. In my case, it was tremendous relief. I was convinced that there's a genetic component to this. And my great fear about having children, and why we had so many discussions about having children, was my fear of passing this on to... I didn't want any kid to live with what I had. And so that actually was a relief to me. And so the idea of adopting children was a tremendous relief, because now there was no chance of... And by this point, I knew that my brother was transgendered. And so that suddenly reinforced the concept that this is, again...
Even more reason.
Yeah, even more reason that this has a genetic component, and it may have. We don't know.
We're going to want to get to the operation and what it's been like.
Sure.
There's a period of time in between. Is there anything in that period of time, from the time you decided you were going to have the children until age 67, when I guess it was that when you decided that you were going to go ahead with the surgery, somewhere in there, the middle 60s? Are there any events in there that you want to bring to us before we get to...
I don't think so.
No, I think it was just
a long period of compartmentalization.
Well, and staying intensely busy.
Staying busy.
And I had this tendency and I had to learn how to deal with it because of this intensity of sort of burning out people around me. I went into the corporate world for a while, and even they, I was traveling 350,000 miles a year and teaching all over the world. And they all kept saying, would you stop? Would you slow down? But I couldn't stop or slow down, because then I'd have to think about being transgendered.
Understood.
So in some ways, I've been asked several times the question of, would you go back? Would you go? Actually, it turned out in my particular case, it was something that actually helped me be what other people might call successful in life. We can all argue what's success, but in the metrics that most people use of a successful career.
Of course.
It was something that helped me.
Yeah, it's also a great example for listeners of how fear can generate busyness and success.
Oh,
right. To me, it was the dysphoria was the driving force behind her success.
Yeah, that's what I meant by fear generating busyness and success.
On a quiet day, I would sleep maybe 4 hours. Was a long night's sleep for me. When the dysphoria was, I wouldn't go to bed for days when it would really get intense.
And you could literally you would feel okay during the day with no sleep whatsoever.
Absolutely. Which made it very easy to get through residency in medical school.
Well, it also means that when you were 60 and you were averaging 4 hours a night or less, another person at age 60 who was averaging 8 hours a night, at age 60 you lived 10 years more than that person. I did the numbers on that. I tried myself sleeping 4 hours a night once when I figured out that I'd get 10 more years by 60, but it just didn't work for me.
Well, you need dysphoria.
Me either.
Okay, take us through when we're moving into that period of life where you're starting to consider taking the genie out of the bottle.
No. There was no plan to take the genie ever out of the bottle. And we should tell you the story of how it came out.
Please. Everybody wants to know.
Yeah. I thought I would never tell everyone. By this point, I'm 67 years old, and I assume I'm going to my grave with a secret. And that's fine with me, okay? And we have had this tradition that we've had throughout our marriage of Friday night is sort of a sacrosanct night. It's our date night. And we try as best we can every Friday night to just dedicate that evening to the two of us, and we go do something just for the two of us, whether I was in residency, no matter what we did, except for when I was traveling so much around the world. But we would dedicate that time to ourselves. And we figured it was always a good time for us to, all those little things that come up in marriages and that. And I think it helped our marriage last so long. And so being in Fort Bragg, of course, we've been to all the restaurants at least 10 times. And so we were looking for another little way of, celebrating our Friday nights. And so we started cooking and started getting these different recipes and spending the day trying to, in the late afternoon and evening, cooking a big meal. So one night we had prepared, I think it was filet mignon, or bacon wrapped
sauce.
And with béarnaise sauce, and made a big production of it. And in fact, these mushrooms, we made these fancy mushrooms. It was a recipe we got out of Bon Appetit or something like that. And we, to this day, call magic mushrooms, although it's not the usual connotation. And a bottle of champagne. And something had happened just before that. When I was last in corporate America, it was before I came up here to Fort Bragg, I had some surgery. And after the surgery, there was a complication. And in the workup of the complication, they found out my testosterone level, you were talking about testosterone level, mine is 0. And we don't know when it became 0. It was unmeasurable. At one of the biggest and more prestigious institutions in this country, they could not find any evidence of my testosterone.
You're off the curve.
Yeah, exactly.
You're off the curve.
So
Wow.
One of the things they did, obviously, to treat that was to give me testosterone. The problem is that, in the literature now shows this, in fact, the metabolic specialist I work with said it's almost a litmus test for transgendered people. The part of the brain that's affected in transgender is called the BSTC part of the brain. It has receptors for both testosterone and estrogen. If you give a trans female testosterone, it has a horrible effect. Not like if you give a normal male with a male gender identity testosterone. It has a terrible effect. And we went through that. Linda can tell you, talk about
aggression, at that time.
And not able to sleep, and the dysphoria just became, the dysphoria, I had controlled it all my life, and suddenly I couldn't control it.
You were taking a dose that one would give to a male.
Correct.
Yes.
But you were receiving it as a female. It would be almost as if we gave that kind of a dose to Linda.
Well, actually, but the effect is even worse than giving it to a female.
So?
For some, they don't quite understand it yet. So, luckily, and I say luckily, my liver reacted adversely. It probably has nothing to do with being transgendered. So they kept lowering the dose. And I immediately noticed that every time they lowered the dose, the dysphoria got less. And so eventually I had to come off of it completely. Well, then my health started to deteriorate. And the reason my health deteriorated is because if you look at the immune system, part of what feeds into how we form our immune system are the sex hormones. And I had none. So I suddenly had to do something. Everyone thought I had cancer. I was losing weight. My family, everybody was concerned I had cancer. I lost all my energy. And so there's a standard protocol, and I tried some doses of estrogen.
That's what I thought you were going to say.
And immediately the dysphoria went away. Suddenly I was feeling great. My health improved. My weight started to come back. But another thing happened. Linda, and she can tell you, kept saying, "What is going on with you?" I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Something's different about you." Well, we'd had this discussion several times, and that night, with, again, béarnaise sauce, mushrooms,
champagne.
She said to me,
Does it every time.
she said, "That's it. I want to know what's going on. There's something very different about you." She said, "I like the change, don't get me wrong, but there's something very different." Well, we have to say, I just can't lie to Linda. And so it was either not answer her And I wasn't going to lie to her, so I said, I don't know how to, in that moment, I said, I don't know how to tell you this, and that's how it came out.
Just
Wow.
blurted it out.
So
Wow.
I'm telling her,
The first time you actually asked in a certain way, and so you got an honest answer.
she never had a reason to ask
No.
before. I never gave her a reason to ask it
it
or
was
question
so
it.
her demeanor was so different. I mean, she's just so easy to get along with and happy, and just we were having more fun, and it just was striking.
I could
The
sleep.
difference.
So you hear what you just heard over the champagne and Bernays, and what
I cried,
you cried.
but I cried out of sadness to think that
How long?
she had lived her whole
Yeah.
life with that.
Bless your heart.
That was my first
Yeah,
reaction.
immediately empathetic.
Oh yeah, totally. And people ask me, well, weren't you angry? Didn't you get mad that she kept this lie from you? I've never ever felt that way at all. Because we've loved each other for, they've been married 45 years when she told me this. And it would be like your loved one telling you they had a disease or something. I mean, what are you going to do? Walk away from something like that? And I'll tell you another thing that I was really relieved, because I thought, what if she tells me she's had an affair, or she is, gay? And, I can't compete with that. So it was
Oh,
almost...
you mean if the gender preference turns out to be boys, not
Yes,
girls?
that
Yeah.
she liked, or
Exactly.
Bill at the time
Right.
was,
Yeah.
gay,
Right.
or was having an affair,
Mhm.
and something that I would be angry, very, very angry. But this, I just was so sad, because I just thought, oh my gosh, for her to live her life like this, with
Well,
that struggle.
Yeah, I think it's a tribute to you as a person that your reaction was immediately empathetic rather than selfish and what it's doing to me and so on. You immediately thought of what Kate, as Bill, had been going through for so many years, and it really is a tribute. I know of cases in my own practice where someone came home and said that they had a gender issue like that. And I know of a case with a wife the next morning took the child and moved 3,000 miles away, and the husband was like in a
Yeah.
what do I do now kind of
that never
situation.
even entered
I
my
can
mind.
no, not just the
Never.
opposite. You were immediately empathetic. Actually, people have asked me a bit about the program because we sent out announcements and so on, and they asked about, what do I think about you, any comments about you, and what I don't know if this is a direct quote from you or if I made it up in my head, but I thought I'd heard that you'd said, or maybe it was in the documentary I saw, that you said, I fell in love with the person, not the genitals. Mm-hmm. Does that sound like something you said, or did I make that up?
No, maybe along the way. I don't think I said it maybe that way, but
frontally. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I look at Kate as, to me, love doesn't have a gender, and love doesn't have a sexual preference. I mean, love is love, and if you love somebody, and after 45 years, I think our love matured to the point where, it was unconditional. I mean, anything could happen to us and we still would be together. And that's...
So that's what happened over the Bernays and the champagne.
And the champagne.
That was the beginning.
Right?
No,
And what we call the magic mushrooms, because
Because in your case, they were magic mushrooms, but not psilocybin.
I do have to add, though, that
Yes.
it took me a year to grieve the loss of Bill. I had to grieve. I had to grieve the loss of my husband.
Mm-hmm.
So this isn't something that just happened overnight.
Yes.
Yes, I was very sad, but Kate gave me the time that I needed before we made any decisions about going forward with it.
As you're grieving the loss of your husband, are you getting acquainted with a new person?
Yes.
And
Yes.
so you can somewhat begin to celebrate a
Yes.
new person in your life,
Absolutely.
but familiar because you love the spirit of the person,
The soul.
the soul
The
of
soul,
the person,
yes, is always there.
but grieving the
grieving
William,
the
the
loss,
Bill.
the William, the body, just and the fact that she's, he is not going to be my husband anymore. It's going to be,
Yes.
you know, this woman that I'm going to be living with, and we're starting a new relationship. And, you know, that, but it did take me a year. It took me a good year to really, I kept asking myself, I did a lot of soul searching, and I kept asking the question always asked, well, can I really live without Bill? Do I want to live without Bill? And the answer was always no. You know, I always would say, no, I don't want to live without this person. I want to do what I have to do so we can stay together. And then just magically one morning I woke up and I said, okay, this is it. Bill is gone and we're on to a new life. And it's been nonstop ever since. I said, okay, let's get to work making you a woman.
Well, that's where I was going next.
Yeah.
After the famous dinner, then there's work to be done, isn't
Well,
there?
and that
But
night,
it took a year to get to that point.
that night, Linda said, well, we can work through this. And I made her the promise, which I kept throughout, which is that we grew up outside New York City, and New York City subways in those days had a red handle. And I said, you are to consider you have the red handle. I've lived with this. I've suppressed it for, 67 years. If you at any time, I do not want to jeopardize our marriage. If at any point you can't live with this, you pull the red handle, and I promise you I will stop.
In terms of moving ahead towards the surgery, the
Absolutely.
transformation,
It will
and so
stop.
on.
I'll be Bill again, and
Yeah.
that's just the way it is. I lived with it for 67 years, and I'll live with it till the day I die.
Well, that's very noble of you.
Well, I just know it was
It's a
that
sacrifice.
much. My marriage
Yes.
meant that much to me that was certainly something I was willing to. And I had this tremendous relief that now she at least knew. I wasn't. I always had this
Yeah.
horrible guilt that just gets bigger and bigger of. I haven't told her this,
Yeah.
but you get so far down now, and life's gotten so complicated. And I was convinced since the time I was 5 years old that the day this secret came out, my life was over.
Yes.
So here I told her, she starts crying, but my life didn't end. I mean, it was like this big shock. So how do I deal with this? And I also came to the rapid realization that it's not about me. The people around me were going to have to go through a much more dramatic transition than I did. I knew who I was. Certainly when I look in the mirror, what I see is very different than what I've looked at all my life. But other than that, Linda, whose gender identity is female, whose sexual preference is male, now has to decide, can she give up one of her preferences to keep this marriage intact?
That's right. And that's what...
And she has to go through it. I didn't have to go through it. I still love women.
I agree.
Okay.
I agree. And in fact, that's why it was imperative to me that Linda be part of the interview, that I just didn't interview you alone. And I think in every interview you do, it has to be the two of you.
Well, and in fact, when we decided that night, I said, well, then we're going to do this right. There is called the WPATH Standard, as you know. It's an organization that has long worked to try and figure out the best way to treat transgendered people. I called one of the well-known leading specialists in the area, said, are you willing to take on a nutcase, take on someone at 67 who suddenly decided, he's going to go forward with this, and his wife is going to be involved. She said absolutely yes, and went to a metabolic specialist, so we got started on the right protocol. He immediately said, oh, you're on too low a dose of estrogen, and gave me a bigger dose, and boy, did that feel good.
I bet that felt really good.
That felt great. Guys don't know what they're missing. And we worked through it together. We went to the sessions together, etc. Now, the problem, of course, is they're all focused on me, and I kept getting frustrated that they weren't more focused on Linda. There isn't as much support out there for the spouse, and I think that's a challenge.
And we're getting the word out about that right now because it's
That's
as
good.
I said, it's
It really
imperative.
needs to be.
It's imperative.
She's going through. My kids go
Sure.
through a huge
Oh.
transition. Daddy now is Kate. I mean, that's a major
If
transition.
your kids
for
were
them.
in town, I definitely would have invited them in. No question
Oh,
about
they're
it.
and
because-
they are a kick about this. They're my daughter's a clinical psychologist, so of course she was the one who tested us all. Tested me. Well, what does it mean to be a woman? And just putting on a dress, what does that mean? I mean, she really had made. She gave me a bigger going over than the therapist we worked with. And my son, he was really interesting. He sort of got on the program very quickly, and we knew he'd gotten there when I had gone. I was out as Kate in Maine, where our other house is, quite a bit earlier than here. And so at one time, Linda had said, "Oh, you got to learn about women and some of the fun we get to have, like a pedicure." So we got our nails done, our toenails, and I didn't think about it. And we go down to breakfast, and our son, they live nearby, and they stopped over, and I go down to breakfast, and he goes, "Nice color, Dad." Looking at my toenails, and I said, "Okay, he's got it. He's on board." And he just didn't blink after that, you know.
I'm going to take a small break to read a letter from someone who got the announcement about the program and emailed a question for you.
Sure.
This is from Ava in Madison, Wisconsin. She writes, "I would like to ask Kate, what small but important thing in everyday life gives you joy now as you move through the world as a woman that was not present for you when you were physically male?"
Good question.
That's a good
That's
question.
a really good
Isn't that a great question?
That's great.
Thank you, Ava.
Yes.
I'll tell you that one of the biggest differences between male and female and living in now what I feel is my correct gender is women really have a better world. I mean, and maybe some of it's because of the estrogen. I can tell you that my sense of smell, the way I feel things, colors, all changed. If you had asked me, I would not believe that at 67 years old, the estrogen could have made these physiologic changes. And so I sense the world totally differently than I did as a male. And I think the people around me recognize it. I'm much more sensitive to everything that's going on around me in a tactile and a sensory sort of way. And that makes life far more enjoyable.
I think we had somebody in the audience that wanted to ask a question. Marianne, did you want to come up and ask a question?
Yes, I did. Just
We have a few
couple
moments.
of minutes
Yeah,
that
we
we
just
have
have
left.
a-
We're almost out of time.
I know, I just got a signal.
So I, first of all, really respect what you've done. I have a transgendered nephew, and so I know that how difficult that's been for him, let alone, I mean, we always knew that he was gay at least, but at your age to do that. What I'm most curious about is if you, one of my main things is that I've been involved with the Mendocino Coast District Hospital Board of Directors, where you served 2 years that were quite difficult years full of conflict. And I've been wondering, had you transitioned earlier, do you think that you would have been different? My perception of you until you became Kate up front was I was afraid of you.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I felt
That's
like
interesting.
anger. I was, afraid of you, and just immediately it changed. So I'm interested.
Actually, I transitioned hormone-wise in all 3 years ago. So it was even before I was elected. I was already in the transition period. And in fact, in Maine, I came out about 2 years ago because it's a different situation there. Because we live there, we have with neighbors that and I didn't have patients. See, the biggest challenge for me was I didn't want to affect the patients. Again, it's not about me. I didn't know. We knew I was going to. We had planned I would retire at 70. This was even before I decided, before all this came out about being transgendered. And there's no question that as Bill, it seems that I was more, how should I say, omnipresent than I certainly am as Kate. And I don't know if that was just part of the protective mechanism of just, defending this male identity that I had to have. There's no question. But by the time I was on the board, I was well on my estrogen. That was not an issue at all.
But you were not presenting as female.
No, I was not.
And that
And
must
I
have been
think
I've
that,
got to interrupt you folks. I'm getting signals here. We're running out of time.
Sorry.
Okay.
And I wish we weren't running out of time because there are many more questions and there's so much more information to share. But I want to thank you so much for being here today and for sharing what you have shared, for all those people who are listening and learning.
Yeah, and if I can just say, the reason we're doing this is that, to a large extent, we've had a very privileged life. I mean, I managed to get to good schools and have a good career. The vast majority of transgender people don't have my experience.
There's the actual signal.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Kate Rohr, Linda Rohr, thank
Thank
you
you for
so much
having
for
us.
being here. And thank you all for joining us for our premiere edition of Mind, Body, Health, and Politics. Please tune in again on November 9th at 6 p.m. We'll be back. And thank you very much, Terry Vaughn and Marianne McGee and Mike DeLaura, for making this show possible.